August burned hot and dry. The creek dwindled to a trickle. Thomas worked long hours hauling water for the animals and the garden. Ruth helped where she could, carrying buckets until her shoulders ached. One evening, after the sun had finally dipped below the hills, Thomas found her sitting on her cabin porch, arms wrapped around her knees. "You all right?" he asked. "Just tired." He settled onto the steps below her, keeping respectful distance. "You've been working too hard." "No harder than you." "Yeah, but I'm used to it." They sat in silence, listening to the crickets tune up for their nightly chorus. Ruth found herself studying Thomas's profile in the fading light. He was not a handsome man in the conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his nose slightly crooked from an old break. But there was something solid about him, something dependable. "Can I ask you something?" Ruth said. "Sure." "Why aren't you married?" Thomas huffed a quiet laugh. "Direct question. You don't have to answer." "No, it's fair." He picked at a splinter in the porch step. "I was engaged once. Girl named Sarah from town. But when my father died and left me the ranch, she didn't want to live all the way out here. Wanted me to sell, move closer to civilization. I couldn't do it. This land, it's all I've got of my family. So she married a banker's son instead. Do you regret it? Staying here?" "No." He looked up at the emerging stars. "But I regret not having someone to share it with. Gets quiet sometimes." Ruth understood quiet. She'd spent most of her life in noise, kitchens, boarding houses, streets. But quiet could be its own kind of lonely. "For what it's worth," she said softly, "I'm glad you stayed." Thomas turned to look at her. In the dim light, his eyes were dark, unreadable. "I'm glad you're here, Miss Carver." The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Ruth stood, brushing dust from her skirt. "I should get some sleep. Morning comes early." "It does." Thomas stood too. "Good night." "Good night." But that night, lying in her bed, Ruth found sleep elusive. She kept thinking about Thomas's words. Someone to share it with. When was the last time she'd thought about sharing her life with someone? When had she last had a life to share? September brought cooler air and the promise of autumn. The garden yielded its harvest, squash and beans and the last of the tomatoes. Ruth spent long days preserving food for winter, filling the pantry with jars of vegetables and fruit she'd bartered for in town. She went to town now, riding beside Thomas in the wagon. At first, people stared. Whispered. "The woman from the auction." But Ruth held her head high, did her shopping, and ignored the gossip. Let them talk. She had nothing to be ashamed of. One afternoon in the general store, a woman approached her. She was older, gray-haired, with kind eyes. "You're Ruth Carver, aren't you?" the woman said. Ruth tensed. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Margaret Brennan. Thomas's aunt." Ruth relaxed slightly. "It's nice to meet you." "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said. "For what you've done for my nephew." "I haven't done anything. He's the one who." "He's been alone too long," Margaret interrupted gently. "Closed himself off after what happened with Emily. But I've seen him in town these past months. He smiles again. Talks to people. That's because of you." Ruth didn't know what to say to that. Margaret patted her arm. "You're good for him. I hope you know that." As they drove home that afternoon, Ruth thought about Margaret's words. She hadn't considered that she might be helping Thomas as much as he was helping her. The idea was strange, powerful. She had value beyond her labor. She had worth as a person. "Your aunt is nice," she said. Thomas nodded. "She raised me after my mother died. Taught me most of what I know about being decent. She did a good job. He glanced at her, surprised. Thank you. I mean it. Ruth watched the landscape roll by. You're a good man, Thomas Brennan. Better than most I've known. I'm just doing what should be done. That's what makes you good. They didn't speak again until they reached the ranch, but something had shifted between them. A wall had come down, brick by brick. October arrived with cool mornings and warm afternoons. The cottonwoods along the creek turned gold. Ruth found herself pausing in her work to watch the leaves dance in the breeze. Beauty. When had she last noticed beauty? One evening, she was washing dishes when Thomas came into the kitchen carrying something wrapped in newspaper. Got you something, he said, almost shyly. Ruth dried her hands. What is it? He set the package on the table. Open it. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside were 2 books. One was a collection of poems. The other was a novel, its cover illustrated with a woman in a blue dress. I noticed you looking at the books in the store last week, Thomas said. Thought you might like them. Ruth ran her fingers over the covers. Books. She hadn't owned a book since she was a child. Thomas, I can't accept these. They're too expensive. They're a gift. But. Miss Carver. He looked at her steadily. Let me give you something. Please. She clutched the books to her chest. Thank you. Really. Thank you. That night, she read by lamplight until her eyes grew heavy. The poems spoke of love and loss, hope and sorrow. The novel told of a woman finding her way in the world. Ruth felt seen in those pages, understood. The next morning, she thanked Thomas again over breakfast. I stayed up too late reading. He smiled. Good stories have a way of doing that. Do you like to read? When I have time. Haven't made much time lately. Maybe. Ruth hesitated. Maybe we could read together sometime? In the evenings? Thomas's face lit up. I'd like that. So began their new ritual. After supper, they would sit on the porch, and one of them would read aloud while the other listened. Thomas had a good reading voice, steady and warm. Ruth stumbled over some words, but he never corrected her, just waited patiently for her to work through them. Those evenings became Ruth's favorite part of the day. The quiet companionship, the shared stories, the ease of sitting beside someone who asked nothing of her but her presence. One night, Thomas closed the book they'd been reading and said, "Can I ask you something?" Of course. What do you want, Ruth? From life, I mean. What would make you happy? No one had ever asked her that. She thought for a long time. I want to feel safe, she said finally. I want to wake up without fear. I want to do work that matters. I want. She stopped. What? I want to matter to someone. Her voice was barely a whisper. Not as labor or property. But as a person. Thomas was quiet for so long that Ruth thought she'd said something wrong. Then he spoke, his words careful. You matter to me. As a person. I hope you know that. Ruth looked at him. In the lamplight, his face was open, vulnerable. I'm starting to. Good. He stood, stretched. I should let you get some sleep. But before he left the porch, Ruth called out, Thomas? He turned back. You matter to me too. His smile was like sunrise breaking over the hills. November brought the first frost. Ruth woke one morning to find her window rimmed with ice crystals. She dressed quickly, pulling on a wool shawl Thomas had given her from his sister's old things, and headed out to check the chickens. Thomas was already at the barn, feeding the horses. He looked up when she approached. Cold enough for you? I've been colder. Yeah, but you don't have to be anymore. He finished with the horses and walked over to her. Ruth, I've been thinking. Winter's coming on hard. Your cabin, it's drafty. The stove's not big enough to keep you warm through a real cold snap. I'll be fine. I know you're tough. But there's no sense in being uncomfortable when there's a perfectly good guest room in the main house going unused. Ruth froze. You want me to move into the house? I want you to be warm and safe. The guest room has its own door, locks from the inside. You'd have privacy. But you'd also have better heat and... No. Thomas blinked. No? I can't live in your house, Thomas. People would talk. They'd say. She couldn't finish the sentence. They'd say what? That I'm taking advantage of you? His voice was sharp. Let them talk. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's what matters. Is it? Ruth wrapped her arms around herself. You have a reputation to protect. Your aunt, your neighbors, they'd... I don't care what they think. Thomas stepped closer. I care about you freezing in that cabin because you're worried about gossip. I'm not your responsibility. No, you're not. You're my friend. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. And I take care of my friends. Ruth wanted to argue more, but the truth was, the cabin was cold. She'd already woken several mornings with frost on the inside of the window. The guest room has its own door. And a good lock. You'd be as private as you are now. Just warmer. She looked at the cabin, at the thin walls and gaps around the door. Then at the main house, solid and well-built. One winter, she said finally. Just until spring. Thomas nodded. Just until spring. They moved her things that afternoon. The guest room was larger than her cabin, with a real bed frame and mattress, a dresser, a washstand. A fireplace connected to the main chimney kept the room comfortably warm. That first night, Ruth lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the house settle around her. She could hear Thomas moving in the kitchen, the clink of dishes, the scrape of a chair. Ordinary sounds of another person living nearby. She waited for the anxiety to come, for the fear. But it didn't. Instead, she felt something else. Contentment. Safety. Home. The winter settled in with snow and cold winds that howled down from the mountains. Ruth and Thomas fell into a new routine. She cooked breakfast while he did the morning chores. They ate together, planned the day's work together, tackled tasks side by side. The forced intimacy of winter drew them closer. They talked more, shared more stories. Thomas told her about growing up on the ranch, about his father teaching him to rope and ride. Ruth told him about her mother's garden, about the boarding house before it all went wrong. She didn't tell him everything. Some memories were too dark, too painful. But he never pushed. He just listened to what she was willing to share and accepted the silences for the rest. One December evening, a blizzard struck. Snow piled high against the windows, wind shook the walls. Thomas made sure the animals were secure, then came inside covered in snow. It's bad out there, he said, stomping his boots. We'll be stuck inside for a day or two at least. Ruth had stew simmering on the stove. She ladled out 2 bowls while Thomas changed into dry clothes. They ate at the kitchen table, listening to the wind howl. I don't mind being stuck, Ruth said. It's kind of nice. Cozy. Thomas smiled. Never thought I'd hear you say something was nice about being stuck somewhere. She understood what he meant. This is different. I'm not locked in. I'm just weathering a storm with a friend. Is that what we are? Friends? Ruth looked at him across the table. Over the past months, she'd memorized his face. The scar on his chin from a childhood fall. The crinkles around his eyes when he smiled. The way his hair stuck up in the morning before he smoothed it down. "Yes," she said. "That's what we are." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Friendship was part of it, but there was something more. Something she wasn't ready to name yet. The storm lasted 2 days. They read books, played cards, told stories. Thomas taught her a song his mother used to sing. Ruth showed him how to make the bread his sister used to bake. On the second night, with the fire burning low and the storm finally passing, Ruth found herself sitting close to Thomas on the sofa. Not touching, but close enough to feel his warmth. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For this. For all of it. For seeing me as more than what I'd been reduced to." Thomas turned to look at her. "You were never less than what you are, Ruth. You're strong, capable, kind. You always were. Some people just couldn't see it. You saw it." "Yeah. I did." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Ruth felt her heart racing. It would be so easy to lean forward, to close the distance, to see if his lips were as gentle as his words. But she couldn't. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the memories too raw. As if sensing her thoughts, Thomas stood. "I should let you get some rest. Morning will come early even with all this snow." "Thomas?" He paused at the doorway. "I'm glad I'm here. With you." His smile was soft, sad, hopeful. "So am I, Ruth. So am I." January brought a cold so bitter that even the main house struggled to stay warm. Ruth woke one morning to find ice in her water pitcher despite the fireplace burning all night. She dressed in layers and hurried to the kitchen, where Thomas already had coffee brewing. "Creek's frozen solid," he said, not looking up from the stove. "I'll need to break through to water the livestock. I'll help." He glanced at her. "It's brutal out there." "Then you shouldn't do it alone." They worked together for hours, Thomas swinging an axe to break the ice while Ruth hauled buckets to the thirsty animals. By the time they finished, both were exhausted, fingers numb despite thick gloves. Inside, Ruth made hot soup while Thomas built up the fire. They ate in tired silence, then Ruth noticed him flexing his right hand, wincing. "Let me see," she said. "It's nothing." "Thomas." He sighed and extended his hand. The palm was blistered from the axe handle, the skin raw and angry red. Ruth fetched clean cloths and the tin of salve from the cupboard. "This is going to hurt," she warned. "I know." She worked carefully, cleaning the blisters and applying salve with gentle fingers. Thomas watched her face as she concentrated, her brow furrowed, her lip caught between her teeth. "You're good at taking care of things," he said quietly. "I've had practice. Taking care of yourself, mostly." Ruth wrapped his hand with clean cloth. "That's all I ever needed to do. Until now." "Until now?" She tied off the bandage and looked up at him. "Now I have someone else to care about." The words hung between them, more intimate than she'd intended. Thomas's good hand came up slowly, hesitantly, and touched her cheek. Just the lightest brush of fingertips. "Ruth." She leaned into the touch for just a moment, then pulled back. "Your hand needs rest. No work tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am." But his eyes held questions she wasn't ready to answer. The next morning brought a visitor. Ruth was kneading bread when she heard the horse. She looked out to see a woman dismounting, tall and elegant even in heavy winter clothes. Thomas went out to greet her. Through the window, Ruth watched them embrace. The woman looked toward the house, and Thomas gestured, explaining something. Then they both came inside. "Ruth," Thomas said, "this is my sister, Emily." Emily was beautiful despite the weariness in her eyes. She had Thomas's coloring but delicate features. She studied Ruth with open curiosity. "So you're the woman my brother can't stop writing about," Emily said. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He writes about me?" "Constantly." Emily smiled. "All good things, I promise." Over coffee and fresh bread, Emily told stories of California, of her husband and daughter. But Ruth noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she held her cup, how her gaze darted to the windows. The scars Thomas had mentioned were invisible but clearly still there. When Thomas stepped out to tend the horses, Emily turned to Ruth. "He saved me, you know. When everyone else said I was ruined, used up, he came for me. Told me I was still his sister, still worthy of love." "He's a good man," Ruth said. "He is. But he's been alone too long." Emily leaned forward. "I see the way he looks at you. The way you look at him when you think no one's watching." "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Emily's voice was gentle. "I know what it's like to be afraid. To think you're too broken for love. But Ruth, you're not broken. Neither is he. And maybe you could be not broken together." Ruth's throat tightened. "It's not that simple. Love never is. But it's worth it anyway." Emily stayed 3 days. Ruth watched how Thomas was with his sister, patient, protective, never pushing her to talk about painful things. She saw the same care he'd shown her from the beginning. On the night before Emily left, the three of them sat by the fire. Emily told a story about Thomas as a boy, how he tried to rescue a baby bird and ended up with a family of sparrows living in his room all summer. "He's always been like that," Emily said, laughing. "Can't stand to see something helpless and not try to help." "I'm sitting right here," Thomas protested. "We know," both women said in unison, then laughed together. In that moment, Ruth felt something shift inside her. This was family. Not perfect, not without scars, but real. And she was part of it. When Emily left the next morning, she hugged Ruth tight. "Take care of him," she whispered. "And let him take care of you." "I will," Ruth promised. February came with a thaw. The snow began to melt, revealing brown grass and muddy earth. The creek swelled with runoff. Ruth felt restless, as if the warming weather was thawing something inside her too. One afternoon, she and Thomas rode out to check the fence line. The horses picked their way carefully over the wet ground. Ruth had learned to ride over the winter, and now she sat the saddle with confidence. "You've gotten good at this," Thomas observed. "I had a patient teacher." They dismounted at a section where the fence needed repair. While Thomas worked, Ruth explored the nearby hillside. She found the first wildflowers of spring pushing through the last patches of snow, tiny purple blooms, delicate but determined. "Thomas, come look." He climbed the hill to where she knelt. Larkspur. First sign that winter's really ending. Ruth touched the flowers gently. "They're beautiful." "They are." But he was looking at her, not the flowers. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, and found herself very close to him. Close enough to see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. Close enough to feel his breath. "Ruth," he said, his voice rough. "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "What?" "I love you." The words came out in a rush. "I know I shouldn't. I know you might not feel the same. But I can't keep pretending I don't. I love you. Not because you're convenient or because you work hard. I love you because you're brave and kind and strong. Because you make me laugh. Because you see the world in ways I never considered. Because when you smile, really smile, it feels like the sun coming out." Ruth couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what she was hearing. "You don't have to say anything," Thomas continued quickly. "I just needed you to know. It doesn't change anything. You can still leave in the spring if you want. I won't. She kissed him. Rose up on her toes and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his nervous rambling. For a moment, he froze. Then his arms came around her, careful, tentative, asking permission with every movement. The kiss was soft, sweet, nothing like the rough grabs and forced attentions she'd known before. This was a question, an invitation, a promise. When they pulled apart, Ruth was shaking. I love you too, she whispered. I didn't think I could. After everything. But I do. Thomas cupped her face in his hands. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated or. I'm sure. She covered his hands with hers. I've never been more sure of anything. They stood there on the hillside, holding each other, while the larkspur bloomed around them and the winter finally, truly ended. But loving him and trusting completely were different things. That night, back at the house, Ruth lay awake in her room, panic creeping in. What had she done? What if she couldn't be what he needed? What if she was too damaged, too broken? She heard Thomas moving in his room, the creak of floorboards. Then silence. Then, quietly, a knock on her door. Ruth? You all right? She opened the door. He stood there in his nightshirt, hair mussed, concern written across his face. I'm scared, she admitted. Of me? Of disappointing you. Of not being enough. Thomas took her hand. You're more than enough. You always have been. And I'm scared too, if it helps. You are? Terrified. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I move too fast or too slow? What if I can't give you what you need? Ruth almost laughed. Here they were, two frightened people trying to figure out how to love each other. We're quite a pair. We are. He squeezed her hand. But maybe that's okay. Maybe we can be scared together and figure it out as we go. I'd like that. He kissed her forehead. Get some sleep. I'll see you in the morning. But before he could leave, Ruth said, Thomas? Will you stay? Just sit with me until I fall asleep? You don't have to. I'd be honored. He sat in the chair by her fireplace while she climbed back into bed. He told her stories of the ranch, of the stars, of nothing important and everything that mattered. His voice was a low rumble, soothing and safe. Ruth drifted off with a smile on her face. When Thomas finally left, tucking the blanket around her shoulders, she didn't wake. March brought longer days and warmer sun. The garden needed preparing for spring planting. Ruth and Thomas worked side by side, turning soil, pulling old growth, planning what to plant where. They were careful with each other, learning the new shape of their relationship. Thomas would take her hand while they walked. Ruth would lean against him while they read in the evenings. Small touches, small intimacies, building trust brick by brick. One evening, Thomas sat her down at the kitchen table. I need to ask you something. And I want you to answer honestly. Ruth's stomach clenched. All right. Do you want to stay here? Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to build a life here? Yes, she said without hesitation. I want to stay. With me? With you. Thomas pulled something from his pocket. A ring, simple gold, slightly worn. This was my mother's. And my grandmother's before that. It's not much, but... He took a deep breath. Ruth Carver, will you marry me? Ruth stared at the ring, her mind spinning. Marriage. She'd never thought she'd want that, never thought she'd be asked as a free woman, with choice and agency. I know it's fast, Thomas said quickly. We can wait if you need. Yes. What? Yes. Ruth looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I'll marry you. Thomas slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, deep and long, and Ruth felt the last walls around her heart finally crumble. They married in April, in the small church in town with Margaret and Emily as witnesses. Ruth wore a simple blue dress that Emily had brought from California. Thomas wore his Sunday best, his hair combed neat, his hands trembling as he took Ruth's. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently. Ruth felt the weight of eyes on them, townspeople who'd watched her journey from auction block to bride, but she didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see that she had survived. That she had found something precious in the ruins. The ranch became truly theirs. Ruth planted a garden twice the size of the previous year. Thomas expanded the herd. They worked together, ate together, slept in the same bed with careful respect for boundaries Ruth still needed. One night in May, Ruth woke from a nightmare, gasping. Thomas was immediately alert, pulling her close. "You're safe," he murmured. "I've got you." "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I thought they were gone, the dreams, but healing isn't a straight line." He stroked her hair. "And you don't have to apologize for it." She clung to him until her breathing slowed. "Tell me about tomorrow. Tell me about normal things." So he did. He told her about the fence that needed mending, the garden that would need watering, the bread they'd bake together. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. "We're going to have a good life," he said. "Not perfect. But good." Ruth nodded against his chest. "We already do." Summer came in full force. The garden flourished under Ruth's care. One afternoon, she was picking beans when she heard a commotion from the road. A wagon approached, driven by a man she didn't recognize. In the back, huddled under a blanket despite the heat, was a young woman. Thomas came out of the barn as the wagon pulled up. "Can I help you?" The man looked uncomfortable. "Heard tell you might, that is, there's a woman might need a place. My wife's sister. Her husband died, left her with nothing. Town where she lives, they're saying she needs to, well, they're saying things that aren't Christian." Ruth set down her basket and approached. The woman in the wagon looked up, eyes hollow with grief and fear. She couldn't have been more than 19. "What's your name?" Ruth asked gently. "Abigail," the girl whispered. Ruth looked at Thomas. He nodded slightly. She turned back to Abigail. "Would you like to stay here for a while? Get your feet under you? I don't have money to pay." "We don't want money." Ruth extended her hand. "Come on. Let's get you inside and fed." Over the following months, Abigail wasn't the only one who came. Word spread quietly through the territory. The Brennan Ranch was a place where women could find refuge. Where they could work if they wanted, rest if they needed, and leave when they were ready. Ruth became something of a mother to them all, teaching skills, listening to stories, offering the kind of grace she'd once received. Thomas built another small cabin, then another. The ranch grew not just in land but in purpose. One autumn evening, Ruth and Thomas sat on their porch watching the sun set. 2 years had passed since the auction in Bitter Creek. The woman Ruth had been then felt like a stranger now. "You ever regret it?" she asked Thomas. "Spending that money? Taking on all this?" Thomas took her hand. "Not once. Best $200 I ever spent. I wasn't worth $200. You were worth everything." He pulled her close. "And you still are." Ruth leaned into him, watching the sky turn gold and purple. In the distance, she could hear laughter from one of the cabins. Someone was singing. Life, messy and imperfect and beautiful, carried on. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." And in that moment, sitting on a porch in the Arizona Territory with the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, Ruth Carver Brennan understood what it meant to be truly free. The following spring brought unexpected news. Ruth stood in the kitchen one morning, hand pressed to her stomach, trying to understand what the doctor from town had just confirmed. A baby. She was going to have a baby. Thomas found her there hours later, still standing frozen. Ruth? What's wrong? She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. I'm pregnant. He went pale. Are you, do you want? I'm terrified, she whispered. What if I can't do it? What if I can't be what a child needs? Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides and held her. You'll be exactly what they need. You're strong, kind, patient. You're going to be an amazing mother. How do you know? Because I see how you are with every woman who comes here. How you care for them, teach them, believe in them. You'll do the same for our child. Ruth buried her face in his shoulder. What if I'm like her? Like who? My mother. What if I love them too much and then leave them alone? Thomas pulled back to look at her. Your mother didn't choose to leave you. And you're not alone. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. The baby came in December, during the first snow. A girl with dark hair and gray eyes like her father. Ruth held her daughter and wept, not from pain or fear, but from overwhelming love. What should we name her? Thomas asked, touching the baby's tiny hand. Ruth thought of purple flowers pushing through snow. Of new beginnings and stubborn hope. Lark. Her name is Lark. The ranch prospered. Lark grew strong and curious, toddling after her mother in the garden, riding in front of her father on his horse. More women came and went, each leaving with something they didn't have before, maybe skills, maybe confidence, maybe just the memory that someone had believed in them. On Lark's 3rd birthday, Ruth stood in the garden watching her daughter chase butterflies. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Happy? He asked. Ruth leaned back against him. More than I ever thought possible. You deserve it. So do you. They stood there, watching their daughter play, while the sun warmed their backs and the breeze carried the scent of growing things. Ruth thought about the girl she'd been, kneeling in the dust of Bitter Creek. If she could go back and tell that girl what was coming, the love, the home, the family, would she believe it? Maybe not. But she'd lived it. She was living it still. That night, after Lark was asleep, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with her journal. She'd started keeping it after the wedding, recording not just events but feelings, hopes, dreams. On this night, she wrote. 3 years ago, I was sold for $200. Today, I am priceless. Not because of what I can do, but because of who I am. Because someone saw me as human when others saw only property. Because I chose to trust when trust seemed impossible. Because love, real love, isn't about ownership. It's about freedom. I was bought once. But I have been freed 1,000 times over. By Thomas. By this land. By every woman who walks through our gate and teaches me that survival is only the beginning. That there's life after trauma. That we are all worth saving, including ourselves. If anyone ever reads this, I want them to know, you are not what was done to you. You are not your worst day. You are not beyond redemption or love. You are human, and that is enough. She closed the journal and looked out the window at the dark Arizona night. Somewhere out there, another woman might be kneeling in dust, believing she had no value. Ruth couldn't save them all. But she could save some. And she could offer them what she'd been offered, a bed, a place to rest, and the radical notion that they deserved both. Thomas came into the kitchen, saw her at the window. Coming to bed? She smiled. Yes. I'm coming. And as she took his hand and let him lead her to the bedroom they shared, Ruth Carver Brennan knew one true thing: she had come home at last.